Shavua Tov. I'd like to talk about the most mysterious passage in the Torah connected with the idea of Brit Milah, the covenant of the circumcision. And that is the episode where Moshe has finished his dialogues with the Kadosh Baruch Hu at the burning bush, and he's being dispatched to go to Egypt, to Mitzrayim, to bring the people out. And there's this very strange occurrence where he gets his wife and sons together. They saddle up their donkey. They're riding to Egypt. And then we get to this interlude where it says, "Vayhi b'derech b'malon, vayifkeshehu Adonai vayvakesh hamito, v'tikach tzipora tzor v'tichrot et orlat benah, v'tag'a leraglav, v'tomer ki hatan damim ata li. וירף ממנו אז אמרה חתן דמים למולות." So, to read the translation here, it's, "And came to pass by way in the inn that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and threw it at his feet and said, 'Surely a bridegroom of blood are you to me.' So he let him go. Then she said, 'A bridegroom of blood you are because of the circumcision.'" So this is a very peculiar and enigmatic passage. A lot of things don't make sense about it. Narratively, the most basic one is that Moshe has just been sent on a mission from Hashem directly, and even maybe the most important mission that Hashem ever gave anyone, and on his way to trying to comply with the command that he received from Hashem, Hashem is suddenly trying to kill him. It makes no sense, right? What would the possible reason for that be, for Kadosh Baruch Hu to send him on a mission only to then try to kill him, as though he's trying to sort of stop him from even getting to Egypt? It's not even like he's trying to kill him in Egypt, seemingly. It's like he's trying to sort of trip him up on his way. So that doesn't make sense. It also is just very unclear what this has to do with circumcision. Why would circumcision enter into the discussion just because Moshe's life is in danger somehow? And why also would Zipporah, his wife, be the one to do the circumcision? Usually that's the mitzvah of the husband. And what does she have to do with the story here? And then there's also even this kind of enigmatic and weird repetition where, first of all, she makes this declaration, like, "You are married to me by the blood." And then she has to add repetitively, or the Torah adds repetitively, and she said that when she said Chatan Damim, a bridegroom of blood, it was in reference to the circumcision. And, there's no reason we would have thought it would be in reference to anything else, seemingly. So how did that even come up? And so you lay all those things out, and that's all already very puzzling. And I think sometimes we handle problems like this in Torah with a plethora of midrashim that have become very familiar, where you can explain it all away by just saying, "Oh, well, it's a mitzvah that was incumbent on Moshe to circumcise his son Eliezer, his younger son, and he hadn't done it, and so Hashem was angry with him that he hadn't performed the mitzvah." And Rashi also relays from Chazal this midrash that Tzipporah saw that the danger that Moshe was in was that a serpent came and was swallowing Moshe and could swallow him up to his waist, or sort of the area of the circumcision, from the head, and then couldn't, and then tried to go from his feet and also stopped there. And so that showed her somehow that it was about the circumcision, and so that's why she performed it. And I mean, you can obviously, if you like, leave it at that and say, "Oh, okay, so the Midrash adds some extra storyline, and now it's peculiar, but at least it's explained." But obviously, that actually just begs questions. And more to the point, when Chazal say things like this, they really are leaving trails of breadcrumbs and kind of trying to get us to realize some things about the text that are not so obvious but are there. And so I think that's what we'd like to try to excavate here. Is, can we understand what the text is saying and why it's so peculiar and enigmatic? And I think the way we're going to do that is by realizing that really this episode is extremely parallel to another one in the Torah in many, many details. I hope we'll manage to list all of them. And by seeing it through that lens, we suddenly realize more what the point of this sequence of events is and what the Torah is getting at. And I think the starting point is to realize the next thing after this episode happens is Vayomer Adonai el Aharon lech likrat Moshe hamidbara vayelech vayivgeshehu behar haElohim vayishaklo. And the Lord said to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness to meet Moshe." And he went and met him in the mount of God and kissed him. A few things already that just we can add to the pile of puzzles that we're accumulating, or at least interesting or intriguing things to note in the text. First of all, it says here that they met Behar Elohim, okay, which was already a phrase used to refer to Har Horev, where Moshe saw the burning bush. That's Mount Sinai, right? So Aaron is meeting Moshe in Mount Sinai, but seemingly Moshe has already set out for Mitzrayim with his family after leaving Midian. So the sequence of events seems out of whack here somehow. So that part doesn't make sense. How is Aaron meeting him at the burning bush, so to speak, if Moshe is already on his way to Mitzrayim and there is some kind of way station along the way when this episode with the circumcision happens? All right, so that's one puzzle or interesting point in that pasuk. The other thing is that this phrase "Vayif geshehu behar Elohim," and he met him. Okay, so "Vayif geshehu" as a word only appears twice in the Torah, both in this perek, in this chapter, and we already read the first one. "Vayhi baderech b'malon vayivgeshehu Adonai vayivakesh hamito," and it came to pass by the way in the inn that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Okay, so the first Vayivgeshehu is this strange thing where Hashem is trying to stop Moshe by killing him, and then a few verses later, then Aaron comes and they meet and they have their positive encounter, but it's Vayivgeshehu behar Elohim. He met him in the puzzling place that doesn't make sense, but also he's meeting him with exactly the same phrasing or conjugation of the verb as we have a short time earlier when someone's trying to kill him, when Hashem is trying to kill him, actually. And that is going to at least call our attention, maybe enough to the relevant issues for us to realize what passage elsewhere in the Torah we should be comparing all of this to in order to make more sense of it. Because without yet explaining how Aharon could somehow be associated with both of these Vayivgeshehus, it seems like Aaron is, reacting positively to Moshe when they meet. He kisses him. So it doesn't make sense to say Aaron is the one trying to kill Moshe. But where else can we remember a time when two brothers who've been parted for a long time are having an encounter where they're coming back together, and there's this uncertainty about whether it's dangerous for the younger brother or whether this is actually a positive encounter where they're going to be glad to see each other, right? What I'm of course referring to is when Yaakov and Esav are reunited in Parshat Weishlach, which is after Yaakov has gone to Haran. He's built his whole family there. He's married Rachel and Leah, and then he takes them. He runs away from Lavan with them and all of his sons, and daughter, and he. I may be wrong that Dinah was already born, but I think she was. But even if not, that's a minor point. But I think, in any case, with his whole family, he's running away from Lavan. And then he has this strange nighttime encounter with an individual of unclear identity, where he wrestles at the ford of Yavok, and this is before he meets Esav, but right before he meets Esav, with the sort of looming danger of Esav's anger hanging over everything. And there's some sense of maybe he's wrestling with Esav, and Esav is the one who's actually fighting him, but it doesn't say that in the text. And then afterwards he sees Esav, and it's a positive encounter. And there's even more details that we will need to look at, because there's also the episode with the Lavan before that, where Lavan is chasing them, and Yaakov has this whole argument with Lavan where they make a covenant, and there's this whole question of where Lavan's house gods are, because Rachel stole them. All these details, they seem again like just a jumble of details. But now we start laying things end to end, and we can really show, I think, quite precise and quite numerous points of correspondence between these two bits of text. And it's a little bit hard to even know where to begin, because there's so much of it. I guess we can try to be chronological, and just start kind of at the beginning of each of these segments of narrative. So first of all, Yaakov runs away from Lavan in secret, taking his two wives, Leah and Rachel, and all of their children with him. So he's taking a daughter away from a father along with sons, right? So that's in Moshe's version, Vayikach Moshe et ishto ve'et banav vayakivem al ha'hamor vayeshav arza Mitzrayim vayikach Moshe et mateh ha'Elohim biyado. And Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the rod of God in his hand. Now, that is different in various respects from what happened with Lavan, because he talks already to his father-in-law and says, we're doing this, and his father-in-law gives him his blessing, in a sense, to go, at least to Moshe to go. Maybe he doesn't necessarily understand that his grandsons and daughter are going to be leaving too. But he doesn't have to be exactly like Lavan. He's the father-in-law. His daughter and his daughter's children are leaving with his son-in-law. And that exactly parallels what happens with Lavan. Now, Lavan chases after them. If you want, you could try to make up some story about Yitro, the father-in-law here, with Moshe chasing after them, but I don't think that's necessary. In any case, when Lavan chases after them, and again, like, there are even more parallels, right? Rachel is a daughter whom Yaakov married, a daughter of Lavan, and Rachel, her name, means some kind of animal. Yaakov first met her at a well where he used a feat of strength to help her. And Moshe obviously met Zipporah, whose name also means a kind of animal, at a well where he used a feat of strength to help her. So there's some parallels there as well. But now we get to, okay, so Lavan chases after Yaakov, catches up with him, and Rachel has stolen the house gods of her father, and is hiding them. So she hides them under a pillow that she's sitting on. When Lavan is searching the camp, she claims that she is unable to get up from her pillow, using as an excuse the fact that she is menstruating, although that seems to be a lie. But whether it's a lie or not, she in any case hides underneath that claim the house gods that she's stolen from Lavan. And so now, we go over to the story with, I'll add one more detail, but then ultimately Yaakov and Lavan, they want to make peace and break bread and not, have things come to violence. So after having a whole argument and a dispute, they decide to go their separate ways. They set up this plinth of rocks in Gal'ed, and they cut a deal, so to speak. They make a covenant. But I say cut a deal specifically because the verb what they say is nichreta, we will cut a covenant, or we will cut a deal. We will make a brit with each other. And it's important that in general, you cut deals in the Torah. You cut literally a covenant or a brit. And that's an interesting point, because Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision, involves actual cutting, obviously, of the body. But it is also, in some sense, that is the ot, the sign of the covenant. But the covenant itself is, has content. And in another sense, it is a deal that has been cut between Hashem and Avram in that case, and Avram's descendants. But so why do I mention all that? Because now when we go over to Tzipporah, there are many elements that parallel what happens with Rachel and Lavan and Yaakov. Why? Because first of all, the fact that we have a circumcision is clearly a covenant, right? There's a brit, there's the brit of Brit Milah that's happening, and the verb that's used for the brit, the circumcision that she's doing, it says very explicitly that she takes a stone or a sharp stone, watichroth et orlat benah, and she cut the foreskin of her son, with taga'ah le raglau, and she flung it at his feet, watomer ki hatan dabim matali, and she said, and you are a bridegroom of blood to me. And then it says, Wayaref mimenu azamra hatan damim lemolov. And so he let him go, and so she said, Hatan damim lemolot. And the Hatan damim thing, the bridegroom of blood thing, that's in reference to the circumcision. What other blood could it have been in reference to? Well, that seems totally extraneous and unnecessary, except if we compare it to Rachel. Rachel was the daughter, also talking about blood implicitly, and blood, again, from organs of reproduction. In the case of the circumcision, it's from the male organs of reproduction. In the case of the menstruation that Rachel is talking about, it's from female organs of reproduction. And so, in this weird way, as though these texts are in parallel with each other, the story with Tzipporah says, Azam rachatan damim lemulod, almost as though to disambiguate and to say, this is an instance where the blood that's being referred to has to do with circumcision, like, lest you be confused, because in other related circumstances, someone was talking about another kind of blood, but here we're talking about circumcision blood. That's what it means to be a chatan damim. Okay? And even this word, wayeref mimenu, and he let him go, you could maybe say that there's a kind of a resonance with the word terafim, which is the house gods, that Rachel was hiding. So in this strange and cryptic pair of psukim that we have about Tzipporah, there suddenly is just a lot of intertextuality with what happens with Rachel in this moment where Lavan is chasing. So I don't think that explicitly proves or means that Yitro must have been the reason for the danger at some level in this situation that Tzipporah and Moshe found themselves in. But there still is this sense of his presence, insofar as it does still have to do with something from her father's house. Because, how is it even possible that Tzipporah knows how to do circumcision and that she sees it as a thing? It's because she's the daughter of Yitro, and Yitro is the Kohen of Midian, and Midian is descended from Avram, right? The man Midian who gave rise to the nation Midian was a son of Avram, and the Brit of Brit Milah was a covenant for the descendants of Avram. When Avram makes it, it doesn't say, and you will have one grandson named Yaakov, and there will be a covenant of Brit Milah that only applies to Yaakov and his sons. There's a statement by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is a covenant between me and your seed, right? And so there are other descendants of Avram where it is imaginable that they perhaps maintain some tribal mark of Brit Milah. Perhaps not, right? That's not a requirement necessarily, and we know that they all eventually go off the rails enough that they're not, representing Avraham in the world anymore. But it's very plausible that this is something from Tzipporah's father's house, which is interesting, and we'll leave that point for the moment, but it's interesting in that case why it wasn't the case that her son was already circumcised, especially also because it's just one of her sons. It says Binah. They have two sons, right? They have Gershom and Eliezer. But somehow it's only Eliezer who has not gotten Brit Milah. And that's not explicit in the text here, but the Midrash is emphasizing Eliezer. And so we'll come back to that point. But so far, just like accumulating the parallels. So we're up to when Lavan and Yaakov are parting ways, and with Zipporah kind of playing the role of Rachel. But there's also this sense of, Moshe's life being in danger parallels another aspect, which is this idea of this kind of strange and not totally natural, perhaps nighttime encounter at the inn, like presumably at an inn, they're resting at night, and Moshe's life is in danger. And the Midrash tells us about this thing with the serpent swallowing him, but even if we didn't have that and we just are looking in the text, this sense of, and he sought to kill him, it sounds like one man seeking to kill another man. It sounds kind of like wrestling, right? There's this element of reproducing the sense of this wrestling encounter that Yaakov has at Yavok before he meets Esav. In the same way this is happening before Moshe meets Aharon, at least in the sequence of text. And interestingly, Yaakov, when he's wrestling at that moment, he gets injured in a place that's located basically in the vicinity of where you would have circumcision. It isn't a circumcision, but it refers to the yerech, interestingly, and that word is used even explicitly in the Midrash that refers to this idea of the serpent trying to swallow Moshe. That the gid anasheh that Yaakov has injured is something that's a sort of sinew where the legs meet the main body, and so there is also this sense of like harm or violence or something that needs recovery or healing being done to that region of the body, and that's somehow connected with Yaakov's dangerous encounter, dangerous and strange and otherworldly and maybe nighttime encounter, like what's happening with Moshe. And so we also have a bit of parallel to that moment, this wrestling moment, and even this word wataga, when Tzipporah throws the foreskin liraglav. So the word in the context of this injury that Yaakov received is wayiga. So it's the same verb there as well that also brings up yet another parallel. And then we move on to Aharon. Okay, so there's this encounter between Moshe and Aharon, and as is the case when Esav and Yaakov finally get together, that there's a kiss. It's Vayishakeu. Here it's Vayishaklo. But it's the same verb, and it's almost identical language, and it's these two brothers who are long separated who meet, and they have this positive encounter. But now we finally are maybe in the position to try to explain the Wayif Gisheo issue, right? That Wayif Gisheo was someone trying to kill Moshe, and it was Hashem trying to kill Moshe. And then it's also Wayif Gisheo that Aaron is meeting him. And because it says Wayif Gisheo Behar Elohim, I even might say that this is not chronologically in order, that this pasuk is put there in order to match the chronological order of what happened in the time of Yaakov, so that we can see that parallel in the text better, but that really it might have happened earlier, right? When Moshe was still at Har Choev, Aaron came and met him there. But that the Vayivgesheu here is telling us that although on the surface this encounter seems positive, that there is some kind of threat, there is some kind of danger, there is some sense in which Aaron and his encounter with Moshe is connected with the danger to Moshe's life. And the thing we have to now explain is, what could that have to do with Brit Milah, right? I mean, so all of these parallels exist, but they have to exist in order for us to understand something about this more cryptic version of the story by having all of these comparisons to make. And so at the end of the day, that understanding has to somehow derive from the details of the story itself. There is this hinge in the plot where this Brit Milah happens, and somehow that removes a danger that we now are trying to explain as being associated with Aharon. And the question is, how could that be? So I think that, you don't need the midrash that we talked about with the serpent to get this. But I think that it becomes clearer and more supported when we, if we're trying to explain the serpent swallowing people, it maybe helps a little bit. But I think we can get it from the text first just by reasoning a little bit. What's going to happen right after this? I mean, first of all, even before that, you can just say, what is Aaron's story here? We know the story of Moshe in detail because of this chapter, but or really the sequence of chapters at the beginning of Sefer Shmot. Aaron is also, like Moshe, going to be this leader of the people and this person with a special connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we just kind of take for granted that he's kind of Moshe's sidekick, and that just snapped together at the narrative moment that it was required to happen. But we don't get much of a sense of, like, how does Aaron know to go meet Moshe, and why is he, collaborating with him so readily? Why does he have some kind of role to play? Is it just nepotism that Aaron becomes the Kohen Gadol? He's Moshe's brother. Moshe wants, to have his brother around or something. Or was Aaron somehow in his own right worthy of that? And I think that you have to kind of argue for the latter, that we should think of Moshe and Aaron as having similarities, that they're going to be great leaders because of each of what he has in him, and that Aaron is the one who's been in Mitzrayim with the people, and he's a leader of Shevet Levi, which is the priestly Shevet. Even before there's a priesthood, there's some kind of significance to Shevet Levi as leaders. And if that's the case, then I don't think that you have to argue that Aaron is like Esav, where he maybe wants to murder Moshe. But I think it's more the question of, how should Aaron view Moshe's injection of himself back into the situation in Mitzrayim? We take for granted that Moshe is a great liberator, and of course you want a great liberator. But Aaron doesn't really know if Moshe can be trusted. Moshe was in the household of Paro, and then he went and just hung out in the desert for a long time with this nomadic tribe that doesn't have directly to do with the plight of the Hebrews in Egypt. So who is Moshe, in a sense, to come in and say, all right, everyone listen to me now and do what I say? And could that be a threat to some kind of base of power that Aaron had been building? Is Aaron working in his own way on trying to liberate the people, or do something of that nature? That's plausible insofar as somehow he's in dialogue with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that he ultimately does join forces with Moshe after responding to a call from Hashem, right? And I think that what really helps to underline this also is that this idea of, in the Midrash, the serpent swallowing. Where do we get the idea of a serpent swallowing? Serpent swallowing is Aaron's staff swallowing the staffs of the Egyptian sorcerers. So there is this sense of, this involves Aaron and his staff. And we go over to Parshat Korach, and swallowing is also like the earth swallowing up Korach. And you suddenly realize like that whole story is about politics within Shevet Levi, about who gets to be special and who gets to have status. And that also could be a consideration here, right? That also could be something back and forth between Moshe and Aaron. So there's a possibility of conflict. And not only that, you could say, even if Aaron has no malice towards Moshe, he may at the same time appreciate what Moshe is up against, right? That imagine Moshe, who was raised in the house of Paro, comes to the people and he says, okay, you guys start listening to me. I've come with a message from Hashem. And what if Aaron were not with him, right? What if Aaron were refusing to cooperate, right? Aaron had been offered by HaKadosh Baruch Hu as this antidote to Moshe's problem of not being able to speak to the people. He even later at some point says he's aral sfatayim, like he has almost like lips that are uncircumcised, meaning that he speaks like a foreigner to the people, and he needs Aaron to be the solution to that. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu offers Aaron, but what if Aaron is not interested? What if he doesn't trust Moshe? He doesn't believe Moshe has the right motivations. Indeed, what if Aaron came to Moshe and he said, I notice, you're headed back to Mitzrayim and you haven't circumcised your younger son, perhaps because you're leaving Midian and you're going back and you're imagining that you're going to be an Egyptian there, and that your son is going to be an Egyptian, right? We think of the Hebrews as, they're Israelites, they should get out of there. They've been there for 400 years. They must, at some level, perhaps think of themselves as a kind of Egyptian. And if Moshe hasn't circumcised his son, there's some question of like, are you heading back to become Egyptian royalty? Is that your plan? Or are you heading back to, identify as being part of this nation and these people? And so suppose Aaron said, I'm not going to work with you unless you show to me that you're, trying to be part of the Israelite nation. And that sounds strange because you think, of course, Moshe is part of the Israelite nation. He's the leader of the Israelite nation, but we know the story as it ends. But there's this question of who Moshe is at this moment and how he conceives of his mission. He wants to set the people free, but setting them free and bringing them to Hashem could be, in his mind, a purely ideological or philosophical project, right? Like even the name of the son being Eliezer. Who was Eliezer in the time of of Avraham? He was Avram's servant. He was a man with no blood relationship to Avram, that Avram turned into a follower of Hashem through persuasion and proselytism, or however you want to put it. And so Eliezer as a name represents kind of this idea of Avram's mission to all of humanity. And Moshe may conceive of himself as, I was a prince of Egypt. I could be a prince of Egypt again, but I could, bring a message of justice to the whole world and use that power to do that. There's all sorts of plans that he could be hatching. And Aaron maybe is saying to him, look, if you don't even, circumcise your younger son, your older son, because you were in Midian and he was a Midianite, you circumcised him. Your younger son isn't circumcised yet. Maybe you have plans for him to become, an Egyptian prince or something. That isn't the way that, we can work together. Aaron's refusal to collaborate, in a sense, is a threat to kill Moshe, right? Because the point is, without Aaron with him, Moshe would fail. And even Moshe said that implicitly. He was saying, I can't succeed without help. And so Hashem says, okay, fine, I'll have Aaron come to be your helper. But if Aaron isn't in on it and willing to join up, then the whole mission fails. And it is a death sentence for Moshe. So I think that's the sense in which you could say the Vayifkesheu makes sense in both ways, that Aaron is not trying to kill Moshe per se, but he might be refusing to play along in a way that implicitly threatens Moshe's life. And that has to be fixed with circumcision, because it's about convincing Aaron that Moshe really is going to be part of the nation in a tribal sense. That and you could say that also explains Tzipporah's comment, because this idea of being Chatan Damim, the point is, in a sense, up until this point, Moshe had married into her tribe, and he was kind of a convert to being a Midianite. But she's saying, no, now by doing this circumcision, you are now married to me via this circumcision, in the sense that I'm becoming part of your nation. Like, we as parents are joining the Israelite tribe, because we are doing this in order to show that we're becoming attached to the nation in a way that makes this acceptable to Aaron. And I think that when you see all of these pieces laid out, you realize how unimportant the chronology is in the story, or how scrambled it is. It was all rearranged in order to parallel the story with Yaakov and Lavan and Esav and everything. And it might be that Aaron goes to Har Chorev, and Moshe and he have this conversation, and even this word malon, this hotel, or this inn that they're in on their way, it could even also be the mal, like mulot, the word for circumcision sounds like malon. So we don't even need them to be in an inn necessarily. They could be in a place where circumcisions are done, because they decided to do this, because that was what really removed the threat and made it possible for Moshe and Aaron to collaborate together. And then that ultimately makes the mission that Moshe was going to go on no matter what a success. And I think the remaining point, now that we've laid all the different elements out, maybe I even missed one or two because there's so many, but there's a tremendous number of parallels, as we see, between these passages. And that's helped us to excavate a less obvious aspect of the Moshe story, which is that Aaron is the key to his success. Aaron is the key to why it is that there was some threat to Moshe's life. But now I think we have to answer the remaining question, which is, why is circumcision dafka so important? Why is it not okay for Moshe to take the attitude or the approach that he implicitly did? Like, we understand that Aaron insisted, let's say, on Moshe identifying himself tribally in the right way, but was Aaron right to do that? I think that the answer is yes, but we have to understand, why is it, and how do we also learn that from this story about what would have been the problem with Moshe kind of going in as just a philosopher king who knows what's best for everyone, and just kind of wanting to use power and reason to fix the situation, rather than coming in and saying, these are my people, and I'm siding with them or closing ranks with them. And I think maybe we get part of the answer by going back to when Moshe sort of tried to do that in the beginning, right? That after he kills the Egyptian, before he's run away to Midian, it says, "Vayetze b'yom hasheni, v'hine shnei anashim evrim nitzim, v'yomer la'rasha lama takel re'echa." And when he went out the second day, behold, two men of the Hebrews struggled together, and he said to the one who did wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow?" "V'yomer mi samcha li'ish sar v'shofet aleinu." So the guy says to him, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" Right? That Moshe was at that time a prince of Egypt, But the Hebrew that he's talking to doesn't really respect his authority, because he's saying, look, did Paro tell you to come and do this? And if not, then what standing do you have, to be doing this? This is a point that I think is made very well by Rabbi David Foreman in his analysis of these texts, that Moshe may have kind of had the ambition of being a better ruler of Mitzrayim before he realized that he had to take the people out of Mitzrayim, right? That he wanted justice, but he didn't necessarily conceive of that as being about anything other than sort of giving the Hebrews better justice than Paro gave them. But they don't view him as one of them necessarily. And if they view him as part of the Egyptian system, then they don't necessarily respect his authority. So I think that if that is the background in which we're seeing this thing happen with Aaron, then I think actually in the end, the point about Moshe's son being named Eliezer helps to make things clear, because what that takes us back to is Avram Avinu and the question of whether he could change the world by just teaching enough people about Hashem and bringing enough people to proper relationship with Hashem. There is, on the one hand, real potential in that, right? Like the Torah acknowledges that relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a universal capacity of humankind. And for that reason, it's very appealing to imagine that you could just kind of make the case to everyone and bring people around and do that with ideas, and do that with philosophy, and do that with inspiration from words and from deeds. But what the Torah brings Avram around to is, no, this needs to be based on a nation that's born from your flesh, right? And that has to be a process that goes down through generations, right? It's possible to convert. So at the end of the day, you have people, coming and going, so to speak. But there's a core of descent from Avram and Sarah, and from Rivka and Yitzchak, and from Yaakov and his wives. And you have to say now, what is the reason for that, and how is that related again with Brit Milah? Brit Milah is about, first of all, this idea of combining these ideas, right? That on the one hand, it's about flesh, and on the other hand, it's about a sign you make in the flesh that you're not born with, that is meant to represent relationship between Avram and all of his descendants and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it blends these two ideas, because Brit Milah is a thing that clearly is not about how you're born. On the one hand, it's like the opposite of that. And on the other hand, it is a practice that is passed tribally through a nation whose definition has to do with descent and flesh and all of these kind of biological things, blood, things that are not just abstract and philosophical and ideas that can be communicated. So it makes sense that Brit Milah is a sign of that. But also there's this question of why is it necessary to have that kind of vessel for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's message to the world? And I think there you get that answer in the stories of Bereshit, because even within families of people who are blood related to each other, you have constant divergence. Yishmael goes this way and Esav goes that way. I mean, remember, a big part of the background for our whole analysis here is remembering the animosity between Yaakov and Esav, that Esav wanted to murder Yaakov, that there was such a possibility of murderous violence and rage between brothers who were born from the same womb. And then it's sort of a kal v'chomer, like how much more so for people who aren't even related, that things could go off the rails pretty quickly, where they disagree about something, and before you know it, you have fervent holy war, in some kind of 120 wave circular firing squad, and you don't want that. And so there's this tremendous potential to bind people together into a common project that shared biology has. And what the Torah is saying is, this is going to be hard enough without also putting yourself in a situation where the natural affinity people have for each other is much less. So what you should be trying to do is say, use familial affection as a way of stacking the deck and giving yourself the best chance possible, which is still a tiny one, of getting people to cooperate and getting people to give each other the benefit of the doubt and start learning how to treat each other well according to Hashem's Torah. And you see that with Yaakov, right? That Yaakov's family almost explodes to pieces in the way that Yitzchak's did, in the way that Avram's did. But it just barely holds together, where Yosef at the end of his life is not killing his brothers and they fail to kill him, and everyone seems to be kind of getting along. And so the nation is born at a moment where you manage just barely to use the existence of familial relationship to get these people who are full of zeal and have ideas about relationship with Hashem to stay together and cooperate, even despite their differences. And that, I think, is also where the story with Moshe ultimately leads us, because look at what happens. When we get to the point where the nation is going to be led to Hashem and to Har Sinai to be given the Torah, who's doing it? Who's leading them? It's Moshe and Aharon. It's two brothers who naturally are able to overcome any sense of envy or jealousy, and are able to see their complementary roles that they can play in collaborating in bringing the nation into being. And so, although in a sense the nation was born with the sons of Yaakov, who almost all killed each other, but then managed to climb out of that, Moshe and Aaron, in the text, it just sounds like they meet and they kiss each other and they're brothers and they're going to work together and they're going to do different things, both of which need doing. And it's so beautiful and simple to see that you just don't even notice how difficult it actually was to achieve. But the reality is that we had generation upon generation of brothers nearly killing each other and going in opposite directions. And when we finally are able to fully forge the nation, it's at this moment where brothers can come together and collaborate in bringing the rest of the nation to Hashem. So I think in the end, this is very much an example where you really get to lay two different pieces of text side by side in the Torah and realize they're in very intense dialogue with each other, and where one of them can really help you to understand that which is very puzzling and enigmatic about the other one. And really, you can also run it in both directions and discover new things about each piece of text by seeing it in light of the other.